I'm Diane Winston, Night Chair in Media and Religion here at Annenberg. My colleague, Religion Professor Janie Wamora, and I want to welcome you to Live from LA, Good, God, and Evil. We also want to thank the Provost Initiative for Arts and Humanities for sponsoring Visions and Voices, which has been good enough to put this program together. Well, actually, to sponsor the program, we put it together. And to give us the support to have you join us tonight. Jane and I really believe that television narratives help us understand the ethical dilemmas and spiritual questions of the day. And we're going to be exploring this tonight and again in October. If the conversation interests you, we hope that you can join us for a smaller conversation tomorrow night at 5 and all day Friday, when we'll be looking at even more dramatic series and similar questions. If you're interested in that conference, it's going to be in Doheny Intellectual Commons Room, and there's agendas upstairs. So please, if you enjoy this, come again tomorrow and Friday. I'm going to turn this over to Anthea Butler. Professor Butler is a visiting professor of religion at Harvard Divinity School. She's really a great person to moderate the panel because her interests range from the Sanctified Church to Jessica Simpson. Anthea is going to introduce everybody and make sure they move at a rapid clip so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of the evening. However, before we begin, we made a short reel to help show you why we think that these three shows in particular capture our deepest hopes and darkest fears. Let's roll the tape. Thank you.
Viewer discretion is advised.
The following takes place between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m.
America has been victimized again. Last night's terrorist attack in San Antonio is now the latest in this series of bombings that began 11 weeks ago in 10 different cities. Over 900 people have been killed thus far, and while no one is claiming responsibility for this wave of death, evidence points to Islamic militants. Here in Los Angeles, the mood can only be described as tense and fearful, as the Department of Homeland Security is urging all citizens to report without delay any suspicious persons or activities. We spoke with a department spokesperson who says, quote, "We don't want to start a witch hunt, but we would rather err on the side of caution than become the next target." He then went on to say that the vigilance of the public is our best line of defense against attack.
Hey! Stop! Open the doors! Please, I have to get to work. I'll be late for work. Please, open the door. Come on, man. Open the door. Open the door. I can't believe you. I can't believe you didn't open the door. I have as much right to be on the bus as you.
السلام عليكم. حرروه. اتركونا. عندي اقتراح لك يا أخي. هذه كلمة ربنا. إذا تقدر تثبت إن القرآن الكريم يسمح بقتل المدنيين الأبرياء فأنظروا حركاتكم. ولكن لو أثبت لك أنا أن الإسلام تمنع الإرهاب لازم تتخلى عن ميلك.
هذا نقطة.
لا، ليس نقطة، مناقشة.
Do it. Leave him.
Sir?
Tell me where the warhead is, otherwise you're gonna drown in that bucket.
I can't drown. I can't die.
Right. Commander Donna mentioned that, how if your body dies, your consciousness is downloaded or transferred into another body, something like that?
No, exactly like that.
But you see, I've been thinking, why is this Cylon willing to talk at all? Why does he care if we destroy his body? Won't he just transfer away and laugh at all of us and our stupid human ideas? Tell me where the warhead is.
This is not your path, Starbuck. You have a different destiny.
Don't interrupt me. You see, I'm gonna dazzle you with my poor human brain. You see, I think that you're afraid. You're afraid that we're a long way from home. What if you don't transfer all the way back? What if when you die here, you really die? It's your chance to find out if you're really God. Or just a bunch of circuits with a bad haircut.
I'm not afraid of dying.
The real question is, who is she? Since September 11th, 2001, the twin issues of terror and torture have become both a national concern as well as riveting entertainment. Where television before 9/11 portrayed good and evil in predictable ways, 9/11 was a turning point that turned the small screen into the realm of the shadow, the covert operation, black ops, terrorist cell, waterboarding, torture. Whether in a far-flung galaxy or the suburbs of Los Angeles, or the dank cells of an unknown country supporting rendition, the characters of Battlestar Galactica, 24, and Sleeper Cell have had to contend with being tortured or torturing others. What effect does this fictional world of the small screen have to do with the reality of government-sanctioned and unsanctioned torture that Amnesty International and other human rights organizations struggle against and labor to bring to the public's attention on a daily basis? Do these shows represent, as the title suggested in the Heritage Foundation panel, the public face of U.S. terrorism policy, or the creative nexus of complicated realities that cause us to contemplate torture in different ways than a news broadcast ever could? The panel before us tonight will help us to divine these issues this evening. Let me say that at the outset, it is a pleasure to be with everyone on this panel. Many of these people has caused me not to write anything for months on end. I should be upset, but I will get my revenge tonight if they speak over 12 minutes. Each one of the panelists will have 12 minutes. I'm going to ask you as the audience to have indulgence with us. You can clap after they're done, but I'm going to ask you to hold your questions till the Q&A. When we do get to the Q&A, I want to give you a bit of instruction. I know you want to gush. I know you want to talk about how many things you love, but if you do not come up here with a pithy and concise question for our panelists, I will cut you off. And you will only be left to say frack. So we will keep a tight ship tonight, but first I need to tell you who is on this particular ship this evening with me. First, Howard Gordon. Howard Gordon is the showrunner, executive producer of the hit series 24, winner of the 2006 Emmy Award for Best Drama Series. A 20-year industry veteran, Mr. Gordon first gained national attention for his award-winning work on Fox groundbreaking series The X-Files. His other credits include Angel, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Beauty and the Beast, Spencer for Hire, and Sisters, which means that he's responsible for decades of me not doing any work. He's also the creator and executive producer of the innovative 1999 drama Strange World. Howard lives in Los Angeles with his wife and 3 children. He's also involved with multiple charitable organizations, including the Stroke Association of Southern California, for which he is an active board member. He will be our first speaker this evening. Second will be Cameron Pasha, who's a writer and producer for NBC's high-profile network series Bionic Woman. Previously, he served as writer and co-producer of Showtime Network's Golden Globe-nominated series Sleeper Cell, about a Muslim FBI agent who infiltrates a terrorist group. Cameron soon will be a published novelist as well. Obviously, this is somebody who has more than 24 hours in a day. He has secured a 2-book deal with Simon & Schuster's Atria Books to publish Shadow of the Swords, a love story set amidst the Crusades, and Mother of the Believers, a historical fictional tale showing the rise of Islam from the eyes of the Prophet Muhammad's teenager's wife, Aisha, who grew to be a politician and warrior. An expert on the Middle East, Cameron is one of the few successful Muslim screenwriters in Hollywood. In 2003, he set up his first feature script at Warner Brothers, a historical epic on the love story behind the building of the Taj Mahal. Cameron also holds a JD from Cornell Law School, an MBA from Dartmouth, and an MFA from UCLA Film School. Clearly, he was not watching TV before he started writing. He spent 3 years also as a journalist in New York City, writing for media companies such as Knight Ridder. During his time as a reporter, Cameron interviewed prominent international figures such as Israel Prime Minister Shimon Peres, Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori, and Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. Our third panelist is Dalia Hashad, and she is Amnesty International's Director of USA programs focusing on human rights issues in the United States and violations by the U.S. government. She is busy. She works on a variety of issues, that is my political commentary, not anyone else's, including the war on terror, racial profiling, and police misconduct. Dalia is a host and co-executive producer on a weekly national talk radio show, Law and Disorder, which covers human rights and civil rights issues. Dalia is a board member for the Arab American National Museum, a Smithsonian affiliate devoted to Arab American history, culture, and dispelling misconceptions. Previously, Dalia was the Arab Muslim Southern Asian advocate for the American Civil Liberties Union. She's worked in the occupied Palestinian territories as a human rights legal advisor and also as a chairperson for CalPIRG, California Public Interest Research Group, including tackling such issues as weakening of environmental laws, campaign finance reform, and cuts to financial aid. She received her law degree from New York University School of Law and her degree in environmental policy from UC Berkeley. Finally, we have a person deeply rooted in the sci-fi genre. Ron Moore also got his start in the entertainment business on the writing staff of Star Trek: The Next Generation. During his tenure there, he co-wrote 27 episodes, including the 2-hour series finale, All Good Things, for which he won a Hugo Award in 1994. That same year, Moore was honored with the Emmy Award nomination and was eventually promoted to producer. In 1994, Moore joined the writing staff of Star Trek Deep Space Nine as supervising producer and was elevated to co-executive producer the following year. Moore spent 5 seasons on this series until the end of its successful run in 1999. He's also, in fall of 2002, showrunner and executive producer of HBO's critically acclaimed 1-hour drama Carnival, which I'm very sorry was taken off of the air. I wish it had continued. I'd like to know where that story would have gone. Moore is, it was a real shame. Moore is currently writer and executive producer of Battlestar Galactica, now in its 4th season, and continually making me wonder about things when I wake up in the morning. Battlestar was honored with the prestigious Peabody Award and twice as an official selection of the AFI top television programs for 2005 and 2006. In 2006, Round was nominated for an Emmy Award for Best Writing in a Dramatic Series. Moore is a native of Chowchilla, California, and attended Cornell University, where he studied political science. He lives in California with his wife, Terry, and his 3 children, Robin, Roxy, and Jonathan. Thank you for paying attention, and now first we have Howard Gordon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. we have 12 minutes. I promise I'll keep it to under 8. For those of you who've watched the show, I'll try to. I have a little clip that'll tell you sort of where we've come, and I'm just going to really briefly describe what, in my opinion, is the story of torture on 24, and how, as a narrative device, and how as a story point, and how as a social fact it's sort of it's affected us. So let me start by saying this year begins with Jack on trial. Jack Bauer's on trial in the U.S. Senate in a Senate subcommittee. This, by the way, I think no one knows this except I think this audience here, but Jack has been wandering the earth basically after last season, and he's been served a Senate a subpoena to appear for. To face charges of torture and illegal detention. So essentially, Jack is facing trial for what he's done, and he enters the season in this Senate subcommittee with kind of telling the Senate subcommittee that he has no regrets, and I'll explain that in a moment. But this is from. It's not a particularly good clip, but it's a clip that kind of illuminates a little bit of this idea. It takes place, I think, in the 14th episode of this season, and it's with the senator who was his sort of chief inquisitor. So if you guys have it, it's a short one.
First, I've got to text all my friends all
At the hearing this morning, you said you had no regrets about what you've done. But what I saw was a man full of regret.
Of course I have regrets, Senator. I regret losing my family. My wife was murdered because I was responsible for protecting David Palmer during an assassination attempt. My daughter can't even look at me. Every day I regret looking into the eyes of men, women, and children, knowing that any moment their lives might be deemed expendable in an effort to protect the greater good. I regret every decision or mistake I might have made that resulted in the loss of a single innocent life. But you know what I regret the most? Is that this world even needs people like me.
So you think I'm naive to believe we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard of conduct?
It doesn't even matter what I think, Senator. You just need to understand where I work. Things get a lot messier than where you work on the Hill.
What you've lost, Mr. Bauer, is tragic. What you've been compelled to do in the name of saving innocent life is tragic. But sometimes we need to incur the most horrible losses in order to uphold the ideals that this country was founded on. How can we presume to lead the world unless we set an example?
You make it sound so simple.
Well, maybe it's simpler than you think. Maybe all the things that you've seen and all the things that you've done have clouded your vision.
So in a nutshell, I mean, 24 was a show that actually predated 9/11. It was a show that was about a counterterrorism unit, and in that first year, we had already written a fair bit of it before 9/11 happened, and when Jack's family was, for those of you who haven't seen it, Jack, this guy's a counterterror agent. His family was abducted so that he could participate in the assassination of actually the first African American presidential candidate at the time. So this guy was twisted for very relatable, very real reasons, and as he was pursuing the people who had done this to him, he did bad things to the people, like I think anybody in a thriller, whether it's Matt Damon, Bruce Willis, or it's one of the conventions of the genre. He took the guy, shoved a towel down his throat, and said, "Where's my daughter? Who's got my daughter?" Everyone cheered. There wasn't a problem at this point, and this is and I understand it was a very easy thing to write. I think it was a very easy thing to act. And an easy thing to do. And I think at some level, and then 9/11 happened, and stopping the nuclear bomb from going off in LA similarly had kind of very easily and uncomplicated. And I'm talking about just dramatically. It was a very sort of easy thing to wrap your head around, an easy thing to watch, and an easy thing to root for. And I think 24 in many ways benefited from this post-9/11 environment. I think there was some wish fulfillment to this idea, to the simplicity of this idea. And I think we enjoyed that, that I think unconflicted relationship to torture as a narrative device until last year, which was season 6, which, 9/11, a more distant memory, more recent memory, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, a war that by all measures was not going nearly as well as its planners and executors would have liked. So suddenly this country that, that presumably holds itself to the highest standard is now the perpetrator of these atrocities. And we as storytellers got, and then we were now not only accused of having, aside from having terribly bad taste and telling bad stories, we're accused of actually being mouthpieces for this administration's, conduct in the war on terror. And apologists, and we were visited by the dean of West Point, who actually, told us that we were influencing some of his cadets. We were told that some of the field interrogators in Iraq and Afghanistan were taking a page from Jack Bauer rather than from their training manuals. Meanwhile, by the way, the general from West Point was a tremendous fan. There was a very interesting, conundrum there, and wanted to meet Kiefer as well as reprimand us, but at the end, so the truth is the show was painted, and it kind of is a long-winded way of me trying to get to what challenges we face narratively in this, our 7th season, kind of having been painted with that very, very strong brush that we're now torture becomes this very complicated narrative thing because of its implications to national policy, to the conduct of our soldiers. So we had this real problem in the 7th year insofar as Jack Bauer can't possibly renounce what he's done. And again, one thing I did learn, and one thing that I think is relevant maybe to this panel and to this idea, is the influence of television on policy and on opinion, public opinion. And clearly, this is just a TV show, doesn't hold water. It's one that I tried my best to hide behind, but I'm no longer naive or in denial enough to think that's the case. But I had an obligation to the show. We had an obligation to tell the story about this guy Jack Bauer, who did these things, who did the same things that Bruce Willis and Sylvester Stallone did and do. I don't know if anybody even saw Fringe last night. Did anybody see Fringe? I watched. And, well, there was one moment where the guy, there's a little torture scene, but in it, you'll notice it was kind of just. I don't think anybody wrote any articles about it today. But here we are, the poster children for this policy, and now having the problem of what do we do with Jack Bauer without renouncing the show, without renouncing the past 6 years, without, frankly, renouncing the character. And briefly, I will tell you that we couldn't. I mean, there was no way to do it except to try to make more complex. And by the way, let me give you another rationalization, another excuse that I used. I said, well, Jack Bauer never does it. He's not a sadist. He doesn't go home and he doesn't torture someone and smoke a cigarette and go, I really enjoy doing that. Where's the next one? He's a guy who, and I've said, his soul is stained. He's a broken character. But even that worked only, so deeply. The counter to that has always been, well, but it works. And Jack ultimately is aspirational. We aspire to him and we root for him, and so that doesn't really hold water. And I understand that as well. So this year, what we did, and I think we're all feeling this as writers. I think Kiefer's feeling it as an actor. Is we told that story of whatever it takes and whatever that means, doing whatever it takes from the point of view of another character, a young FBI agent who is on the case this year with Jack. And at best, what we could do is make Jack think a little bit. We've populated the series with characters who can, I think articulate the debate to the extent that it is a debate much, much better. And you saw that a little bit with the senator, who's not a buffoon, who's not a fool, but who really articulately occupies the other side of that debate, of that issue. and Jack, who clearly feels conflicted. And I think my point only is that Jack now, was a sort of an unequivocal hero with all the tropes of the hero in the first year. Now in our 7th year, and with the sort of weight and the filter of current events, we have made, I think, a hero who's a little more conflicted, a lot more complex, and frankly a lot darker. I think the things that he carries around and the weight he carries in the world isn't quite so clear. So anyway, that's sort of the sort of nickel tour through Torture and 24. So I'll take questions later, but
thank you.
That's it.
And you all heard a little bit about my bio, which came from my Match.com site. So I've discovered that it is not effective, so I'll have to try another bio. So that's I have the fortune or misfortune of being one of the very few Muslims who've started really making it in Hollywood. One thing that wasn't on the bio, because it just happened, is I'm actually in New York right now. I am a writer and a producer on a new TV series on NBC called Kings. It was too close. Kings, it will be premiering hopefully in February of 2009. We're filming it right now. It's very unusual. The creator of the show is Michael Green, who was from Heroes, and it is a modern day retelling of the story of King David from the Bible. And that sounds a little unusual, but did any of you see Deadwood? So if you remember Swear Engine, Ian McShane, he's our lead, and so he's just a remarkable actor to work with. But it's a reality where the nation is a kingdom. Ian McShane plays the authoritarian but beloved king of the nation, and a young David, a war hero in that world, rises up and becomes essentially a threat to his throne, which is directly taken out of the Bible, the story of King Saul and King David. And we'll be looking at a lot of some of these issues that I'll talk about right now, Sleeper Cell, on that show in this fictional world. But I hope you all get a chance to watch it in February, because you haven't really had a lot of biblical tales, and I'm glad that there's a show that will be dealing with God, and really the first show that dealt with God in a very long time was Galactica, and so I'm glad to be following in Ron's coattails on that, so we'll be talking about those issues. Sleeper Cell, did anybody see Sleeper Cell? Anybody? A few people? Okay. If you haven't, it's on DVD, the first 2 seasons. Watch episode 4. Episode 4 of the first season was mine. It's pretty good. That was where the clip was from. I actually did not bring a clip here, but I'll talk a little bit about the series and how it relates to what we're talking about here. Sleeper Cell was in many ways, the direct product of September 11th. It is a show on Showtime. I was not the creator. 2 really wonderful guys, Ethan Reef and Cyrus Voris, created the show. Their next series, which I hope you'll watch, is a new Jerry Bruckheimer series called 11th Hour, which is coming out very soon. And that's sort of an X-Files type show. It's supposed to be really good. But Ethan and Cy created the show. They brought me on board as a writer after the pilot had been shot. The show, for those of you who did not watch it, was very unusual. It was on Showtime, and it was a show about a Muslim who is an FBI agent, an African-American Muslim, who is sent by the FBI to infiltrate an Al-Qaeda sleeper cell that they've discovered is planning another September 11 type attack. So you can see it comes directly out of those experiences on September 11th. And I had the great honor of being on that show, and the fact that I was a Muslim added a little bit of a perspective that really didn't exist in Hollywood. The show got a lot of accolades and a lot of criticism, and much of the criticism came from the Muslim community, who felt, okay, here's yet another show, Muslim terrorists, here we go, I've seen this before. But it was interesting, there was a generational divide. The older generation, my parents' generation, were very upset with the show, saying, oh, here we go, you've got these terrorists saying Allahu Akbar, and they're quoting the Quran, and they're killing people. And the younger generation said, hey, look, but the hero's a Muslim. The hero's a practicing Muslim who's out there defeating them, and he's doing it out of his faith and out of his patriotism. So that was the essence, the conflict within the show. We dealt a lot with torture. It's impossible when you're dealing with a show looking at Al-Qaeda to not look at those issues. In the little clip that you saw at the very beginning was from an episode I wrote, which is the 4th episode of season 1, which I'm very proud of. It was an episode where the character that you saw who came into the prisoner in the cell is a spiritual leader, an imam, a sheikh, a religious scholar in Islam, who goes around and he debates terrorists and deprograms them, in essence, sits down with them, goes over the Quran. Now, if that sounds like, okay, that's a wacky Hollywood fictional creation, that's based on a real-life person. There's a gentleman named Judge El Hitar in Yemen who has the fame of being, he's a religious scholar, a young man who basically was brought in by the Yemeni security forces. They have quite a few Al-Qaeda captives, young men who had been sent on various missions that had been caught, and their various forms of interrogation / torture had not been very effective in breaking these guys in their will. And so this young scholar said, well, let me talk to them. And El-Hitar's philosophy is he goes in, he sits down with these extremists. Most of them are young men who are angry for very specific reasons and things that have happened in their life. Most who don't have a very deep Islamic education. In fact, they really wouldn't if they were involved in these activities. He sits down and goes, he treats them with tremendous respect, treats them as human beings. And literally that line of dialogue that you saw there, or at least hopefully some of you saw because it was, I don't know if my head was blocking it, but it's almost directly taken from his speeches. He sits down with them and he says, let's go over the Quran together. If you can convince me that the Quran says kill women and children and disobey rules of war because you don't need them, because that's God's will, I will join you. That's my jihad, I'll join you. And if I can actually show you textually that the Quran prohibits this, then you have to renounce your ways. And remarkably, he's had huge success. He's deprogrammed over 300 Al-Qaeda captives in the Middle East. If you can believe that, he goes and he spends weeks with them. And then eventually they come out, and it's literally like a cult deprogramming. They're crying, and they're like, "Oh my God, we've been on the wrong side the whole time." And it's really amazing the work he's done. The top lieutenant of Al Qaeda in Yemen was assassinated a couple of years ago because his number 2, who had been captured by the Yemeni security forces, was deprogrammed by El-Hitar over 7 months. El-Hitar sat with him, just talked to him about religion, about God, about what the Quran says, what Prophet Muhammad said. And finally the guy's like, "Oh my God, I'm the villain in this picture." And he turned against his own masters. He revealed to the Yemeni security forces where bin Laden's primary lieutenant was hiding out, and they dropped a bomb on him and he's dead. And so, I mean, that's what's interesting is that El-Hitar has been in great demand throughout Europe. Security agencies, Scotland Yard has called him in to teach us, okay, how can we use your techniques to deal with the Muslim community? The only people that don't seem to have any interest in meeting with him is the FBI or the CIA, and that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy because there is, in my opinion, and I'm going to state my opinions, they're not the opinions of the creators of my show, Sleeper Cell, or anything else. I mean, in my opinion, there is unfortunately an institutional resistance in much of America, in our government, to deal with the fact, there is a belief, though, because Islam is a very foreign religion still to most Americans, even though it's actually quite a large religion. There's probably about 7 to 9, possibly even more million Muslims in the United States. But if you go to Britain or you go to France, Muslims are a huge percentage of that population. So people deal with them. They have halal stores everywhere. That's part of their culture. They understand that Islam is there. Here it still seems very foreign. And so many of our security institutions have difficulty believing that this religion of these camel herders could actually have anything good in it. That there actually might be something in the religion that would save these people from this kind of destructive behavior. So that's an educational process we're dealing with. We highlighted that on the show, and I was flooded with emails the next day from all over the world. People had seen it and said, "Wow, I learned more about Islam in this 1 hour," because it was a Quranic debate. And I actually used the verses of the Quran that the extremists say, "Oh, it says we can do this." And I showed how those verses were then correlated to other verses, because the Quran, for those who have read it, it's not linear. It's not, the Bible is actually a linear document. It starts off with Genesis and goes through history. The Quran intentionally is not linear. There will be any chapter of the Quran will start off anywhere in time, because the idea is God's mind isn't linear, right? So you'll start off with the story of Abraham, you'll jump to Moses, you'll jump to Jesus, you'll jump to the Day of Judgment, jump to Muhammad. I mean, literally, and you have to figure out what the pattern is. And so that's one of the challenges is you'll see a verse in the Quran that says fight the unbelievers. Okay? Well, no, you have to debate, well, what does unbelievers mean and what does fight mean? But you say that, you say, okay, kill the unbelievers. Then there's a verse 4 chapters later that correlates to that verse intentionally, that says, but do not do this. Right? And if you just take that one verse out of the Quran, say, oh, it says right here, kill the unbelievers, well, then you've intentionally ignored the correlating verse. And because the Quran isn't linear, if you're not sophisticated, you can do that. You can just say, oh, it's right there, the verse is right there, and I don't need to read the rest of it to see how it connects. So we showed that, and people were quite shocked to see that within the Quran itself, there's very clear condemnation of this behavior that, to my regret, as a Muslim, has become associated with Islam. We were talking earlier at the dinner that Muslims, for most of the last 14 centuries, took great pride as a civilization that we would not drop down to the levels of these European barbarians when it came to warfare. For us, Islam from the very beginning, Prophet Muhammad fought battles, but he established very strict rules of war. Don't kill women, don't kill children, don't kill the elderly. If your enemy drops his weapon, you can't kill him. If you can't burn trees, you can't poison wells. These were very inconvenient rules of war in the 7th century, where your adversaries did not follow them. And yet Islam became a massive civilization, partly because when it was fighting other people. They said, these guys are fighting, these guys have a sense of ethics in warfare, and the local populations would often come to the Muslims' aid against their own oppressors. So to have this time, when we Muslims took great pride that when we fought the Crusaders, we didn't kill women and children, and they did, to suddenly have my religion being associated, if that's the one thing the two things people think about Islam. Kill women and children, beat your women. That's literally a religion that I love so deeply. That's what I grew up hearing. It's one of the reasons I went to Hollywood to say it's actually not my life experience of this faith. Right? And so that's what I tried to do on Sleeper Cell. We dealt with that. We did an episode that dealt specifically with torture in the second season, where our main villain, our main terrorist from the first season, had been captured, and he was being they tried to we showed some waterboarding and some of the things that were happening in Guantanamo. It didn't work on him. He wouldn't break. So as often happens in real life, he is sent away to a Muslim country, to Saudi Arabia, where they'll get it out of him what they need, right? And so then we show. And because we were on a cable show, we were able to show pretty horrifically what torture actually means, right? I mean, we showed some pretty intense stuff that's very hard to watch. I won't go into it. You watch the second season, but pretty emotionally painful things. And people were shocked as they watched the show because our character was the villain. He killed a lot of people, and suddenly like, I'm beginning to feel a little bit sorry for this guy. That's really painful what they're doing to him. And that was we dealt with that. And we wanted to show the moral complexities of what it means. And part of the challenge on network television is that you can't often show the consequences, right? Just because they're broadcasting standards. On cable television, we were able to go to a very dark place. And the wonderful show Battlestar Galactica is often able to go to a very dark place to show those things. So that's my general talk about Sleeper Cell. I mean, I would love to answer questions both as a writer on that show and as a Muslim in Hollywood and someone who's had to constantly deal with these issues and have to defend my faith, which is now associated, unfortunately, with terrible acts of violence. And so, I'd be delighted to talk to you about that. But the pivotal thing is Hollywood is changing. Shows like Sleeper Cell are getting on the air where you can talk about these issues. 24 is delving into them. Galactica has delved into them. There will be more. And on my new series, Kings, we're going to be looking a lot, because it's based on the biblical tale. Most people actually haven't read the biblical tale of David very very closely. Most of you probably vaguely know, yeah, David killed Goliath. Maybe a few of you remember that he had an affair with Bathsheba. But it's a pretty dark story. And the David of the Bible, and I won't reveal what we're going to do in our series, because I want you to watch it, but the David of the Bible is, in many ways, by our standards, a terrorist. He intentionally kills women and children. If you remember the biblical tale, most people won't remember this. He fled to the other side when Saul tried to kill him. He became a renegade who fought for the Philistines and killed Israelite women and children. When women found out that he'd become a turncoat, he killed them. So I mean, it's a pretty horrific tale, and yet it is. We look at David as one of the foundational figures of Western civilization in Christianity and in Judaism. He's also a figure in Islam, although the Islamic tradition is he didn't do all those terrible things the Bible claims he did. But what's interesting is I talk to my Christian friends, and most of them are not aware of the really intense and violent stuff that's in the Bible that the heroes do. And so this is something that we as a culture don't face. We say, okay, well, these Muslims do these terrible things, and their foundational texts have these terrible things. But if you look at the foundational texts of our own tradition, which most people don't really do very closely because it's uncomfortable, I mean, by the moral standards of our time, there's a lot of horrific stuff that the heroes do. So we have to look at these issues in a broader way.
I'm a stand-up kind of lady, so I'm sorry, folks over there. I'll peek over every once and again. So for those of you who either came in late or missed it, I do not work on a TV show. I don't work in Hollywood. I have a very boring job, but I deal a lot with torture. And as hard as it is to watch some of those scenes, it's even harder to imagine it happening to real people, many of whom who have done nothing wrong, many of whom who've never seen a court, never seen a judge, never had an opportunity to hear what they've done wrong and why they're being tortured. And that's what I do day after day. So that's the perspective that I bring here. And actually yesterday it was perfect timing. I don't know if any of you saw it in the New York Times, but it was reported that McCain was asked who he really felt like in Hollywood, who he was most associated or who he would most associate himself with, and he said Jack Bauer on 24. He said, we have a lot in common because he escapes all the time. And then he was reminded by his interviewer that Jack Bauer tortures people. And he said, yeah, that's right. That's where Jack and I disagree. He believes in torture, but I don't. He says, tell me where the weapons are. Bam! Okay, I'll tell. That's a quote. He said, tell me where the weapons are. I won't. Bam! I'll tell. And that was really revealing in a lot of ways because that's what I want to talk about today. Really, that hits on all the themes. It hits on the themes of images of torture on TV and this myth that's been created in the War on Terror. It hits on how TV depicts torture as producing quick and accurate, bam, I'll tell kind of results. And it speaks to who exactly is torturing on TV. The heroes, people we admire, people who do their jobs incredibly well, people we want to aspire to be like. And it also speaks to another very important issue of policymakers and elected officials, people who create our laws, who are clearly being influenced by fictional characters and fantasy plots. And that's ending up as our national and international policy. So people say the world has changed a lot since 9/11. I hear that all the time. And I think it's definitely true of the world of TV. And to give you a quick sense, the Parents Television Council did a study. And they found that in the years between 1995 and 2000, the 5 years before 9/11, there were 13 images of torture depicted on TV. And from 2000 to 2005, there were 721. It's not just the normalization of torture that needs to give us pause. It's not just that before 9/11, these were villains who were committing acts of torture. You know, if they were depicted on TV, it was the Nazis who were doing this. And now it's people that we are meant to admire, people that we're meant to respect. It's also pitting security against liberty. It's pitting torture against due process and giving the very strong message, not just to the everyday American person watching this TV show, but to our policymakers and to our soldiers who are out there carrying out our war on terror, that in order to save American lives, in order to save the world, they have to torture, that it's a quick and easy way to get results. And it was really interesting because the comment that John McCain made, it produced a lot of results online. I love reading people's comments when they write in. And I want to read two to you. One, somebody wrote in on the blog. It was on the political blog, The Caucus, in the New York Times. You can look up all of the very interesting comments. But here are two of the most interesting to me. Very different perspectives. The first. What I can tell all of you, including the anti-torture people, is that if a plane with a 10 megaton hydrogen bomb was on its way to your city, where you and your family live, and the authorities had the mastermind of the plot in custody, and he knew the location of the plane and the timetable, you might revise your anti-torture holier-than-thou morality. As far as I'm concerned, the subhuman vermin who undertake these crimes against humanity have no rights when they are planning or undertaking a mission to kill thousands of millions of innocent men, women, and children, my fellow Americans. I don't know when this anti-torture obsession started, but at some point, if some more balanced perspective is not developed, we may experience something far, far worse. That was one of the first comments that caught my eye. The second comment that really caught my eye was, well, that's just perfect. John McSame embraces the TV torture guy. I want to talk about the first comment. What that person talked about is the ticking time bomb scenario. It's a staple on much of TV. It's a staple on 24, and it produces the anxiety that made my heart pound when I was watching. I mean, it's good TV. When I was watching that clip just a second ago. But the ticking time bomb scenario, the truth of the matter is it doesn't happen in real life. It just doesn't happen. I've been hard-pressed to find anyone, any military interrogator who said it's ever happened. We have people who with decades worth of experience have said they have yet to interrogate people among their thousands of people that they've interrogated where this was a situation, and yet on TV every week. It's happening again and again and again. And it's creating this impression that in the United States, there is someone out there who has a bomb, who's in U.S. custody, and we need the tools. We need to be able to get the information out of this person. And we have just seconds, just minutes, just hours to do it. And if we don't torture him within an inch of his life, he may not talk. That's the first problem with the ticking time bomb scenario, that it just doesn't happen. But then the second problem with that is that it relies, the way it's depicted on TV, it's depicted as if it actually works. It doesn't work. When you torture someone, they will say anything. They give you any information, unreliable information. When they do give you some real names, sometimes it's the names of people they hate. And they want to send you, I mean, this is actually what we're hearing from military interrogators. They said on TV, torture always works. In real life, it just doesn't. And what we're hearing is that seasoned military experts are saying, not only does this not work, but that they're dealing with a whole class of young military cadets who have grown up watching TV and who are 17, 18, 19, 20, and have been watching this stuff for years, throughout their teenage years, and it is ingrained in their own political reality that not only is this stuff real, but this is the way that they then need to behave. Gary Solis, who's a retired law professor who actually created and taught the law of war for commanders curriculum at West Point, he said that both under U.S. and international law, Jack Bauer is a criminal and he should be prosecuted. Now, this same guy it also says his students, and I guess coming up, he looks like he's in trouble, but his students have been saying to him that Jack Bauer has it right. He said he's got the tagline, whatever it takes. He says many of his students come into his classroom and insist whatever it takes is also their motto. And it's not just the instructors who are telling this, but it's folks who come out of the military or who are telling us this too. Human Rights First works with this former military interrogator, Tony Lagaramus, and he says that he's watched 24. He said in the military they are huge fans of 24. In Iraq, they would trade the DVDs, and they would actually watch the 24 shows together. They'd watch the DVD series together. And then after the show or whenever they were done watching, they would sit around and they would discuss what they had seen. And part of the discussion and what they had seen was the techniques of torture that they had seen. And they would talk about how they could use those in their real life, in Iraq, on the people that they had in their custody. And when he talks about this, he admits now, he says, I used techniques of torture when I was there in Iraq, and it was pretty standard. And he talks about one instance, for example, where they had watched, and it's not just 24, it's other shows as well. I talk about 24 because it's really it's on the cusp, it's on the edge of this trend that we're seeing. And 24, I think, by far shows probably more scenes of torture than most of the other shows, 89 so far. And again, really good television, but but it is having, the question is it having an impact? And I think because it is such good television, it is helping to create, unfortunately, really poor policy. He says, Tony gives one example where he says that after watching a scene on TV or on a DVD of torture, that he and his fellow soldiers decided they were going to recreate the same thing. So they took their army interrogator, an Iraqi, and they put him in a cage, and they dragged him past all these other prisoners, and then they took him around the corner, and they made him scream bloody murder like he was being tortured, and they used it to scare the heck out of the other soldiers, or the other, prisoners. Now, this isn't the worst of what we've seen on some of these shows, but it's, to me, a very scary and real-life example of how policy is getting made really on TV and adopted by our soldiers. Philip Sands, who recently wrote a book on torture, he interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Diane Beaver, who was with the military, she's a colonel in the military, a JAG officer in Guantanamo. And she said at Guantanamo, they were fascinated by 24, and particularly obsessed with the second season, And they would talk about imitating, and they would actually imitate the techniques that they saw there. So all this to say, what we're seeing on TV is not just fantasy. The people who are watching TV are also the people who then leave and go do real life things, become soldiers, become Supreme Court justices. Justice Scalia was recently on a panel in Canada about the rule of law. And he went on a tangent, and he started talking about Jack Bauer as if Jack Bauer were a real person. And he said that Jack Bauer no one would ever criminally prosecute Jack Bauer. Jack Bauer would never be convicted in any court of law because he saved Los Angeles. This is a Supreme Court Justice of the United States who has before him very serious cases on the matter of torture. And he's talking about Jack Bauer as if this is how he's making his policy. So I have 0 time left. And so let me end with, Jack Bauer may be fictional, and this may be fantasy, but the impact is real.
All right, then. And on my little show, yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, I think that the thought that occurred to me, not to get off on a tangent as you were speaking, there is an interesting thing to be sort of discussed that I don't think is ever discussed in American society and culture, which is the relationship between we, the storytellers, and you, the audience, and how essentially the narratives that we spin and the tales that we tell then become something greater than simply 3-act stories that all of us sort of watch as entertainment, and how they really influence the world. And we essentially look at the world and we try to tell stories about what we see, and then you watch our stories and the world becomes, there's this duality to it. There's this sort of the two mirrors that face one another. And I think that it's not, you're not saying it's this simple, but it's not as simple as saying that this is a recent phenomenon. I think that there's a very deep part of our particular society, of American culture, that has formed itself in large part to the national myths that we have told ourselves about who we are, from George Washington and the cherry tree straight on through, and how those myths have really not just informed how we think of ourselves, but have changed American policy in a very real way. From Uncle Tom's Cabin, and how that was an actual inciting incident that helped bring on the American Civil War, to just in the 20th century. If you think about, I was watching a documentary the other day about John Ford and John Wayne, and filmmakers, that was on PBS. And it was interesting, the more I watched them and the more they sort of were, this wasn't the point of the documentary, but they were talking about how Wayne, as an actor and as the characters he played, became emblematic of the American ideal of what we thought about ourselves as a nation, and what we meant on the national stage, especially in the post-war world, where America was a colossus upon the globe, and had ultimate power, and no one could really stand in our way. And how John Wayne came to personally personify that idea. And what wasn't really touched on in the documentary, but what I sort of knew from my own sort of love of history and love of these kind of issues, was how the image of John Wayne in those movies influenced real soldiers and real military officers, and influenced why people went into the military, and people went into many men went into Vietnam and tried to be John Wayne. And it was a very important idea of what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be an American man, what it meant to be a hero, was this creation of cinema, and how we as a culture really took that to our bosom and decided to act upon it. Ronald Reagan was an actor, and became a role for all of this, and we sort of imbued him with an idea of what the role meant to be an American president, and what we wanted to see in and of ourselves. But there's this constant kind of dialectic that goes on between we who craft these stories and you who then listen to them and then bring them into your lives as if they're real. And I think that we are not prepared or we are not trained to think about this. We don't, you know, the people who sit on the stage who do work in television, we don't go into these jobs and think about how Jack Bauer is going to influence people in Iraq, you know, until probably now you do, probably every day. But, you know, that's not our jobs. We sit in rooms with bad food and coffee and white dry erase boards, and we joke around and we talk about, you know, what's a good act structure. And I don't know that there's an awareness of what we do and how it really impacts the real world. And I don't think there's an awareness of the real world, of how deeply influenced we all are by these images we see. And it just struck me that there's a certain sense of, I think, talking past each other that I think does go on, where these images that are broadcast around the world and have such profound impact on people's lives are not created in that spirit. They're not created in the spirit of policy. They're not created in the spirit of this is what should happen, and this is how people should be treated, and these are what rights really mean, and this is the fundamental idea of the law, and this is the ideals upon which the country is founded. These are born of how, you know, what's a good show next week, and, you know, how does this going to work, and what's a good Act 3 hook, and how do I leave them here? And we're operating in a very different place than the way the impact is, and people who consume the material, I don't think any of them really directly look to the material to say, I'm going to be a lawyer like that. You know, I wanted to be Perry Mason as a child and started to study pre-law and became aware that it was really nothing like that, you know. But I was so strongly influenced by the idea of the law and what a lawyer did that I actually did shift my thought and my education in that direction. Anyway, Galactica was born... Battlestar Galactica was born, I don't know how long I have left, but 6 minutes. Ah, perfect. Battlestar Galactica was born in the months after 9/11. I got a call from a friend at the studio who said Universal was looking for someone to bring in a new take on Battlestar Galactica, and this was in February of 2002. It was just a few months after the 9/11 attacks. And I said, well, let me go think about it, because I hadn't seen the original Galactica in a long time, and so I said, let me get the pilot and watch it again. And I watched it. And the original Galactica pilot is all about an apocalyptic attack. It's an attack by a race of robots called the Cylons, who in a moment destroy an entire civilization. And the show is about the survivors who escape and who run off into the night and are pursued forever by their enemies. And I watched this in February of 2002, and I realized that if you did this story again now, it would have a completely different resonance than it did in 1978. Suddenly, this was very relevant. Suddenly, this was something that people could actually emotionally envision, and there was a resonance to the material. And I thought this was an amazing opportunity to do something about the culture that I suddenly found myself living in, and the world that had suddenly changed around me. And if you took that story seriously and you told it truthfully, it would be an amazing opportunity to tell stories in. And as I approached the show, after the miniseries and as we went into series, what really became important to me was positing a show that really didn't tell you what the answers to very complicated questions were. It was a show that, when we did that episode that you saw the clip from, it was called Flesh and Bone, it was from season 1. We talked about it internally quite a bit. This was first season, so I don't remember what year that is. I just think in terms of seasons. And the stuff about Guantanamo was just starting to become into the national media. The term waterboarding I had heard only for the first time right around the time we started talking about doing an episode that involved torture. And internally, we sort of said, well, let's do an episode about that, because in our circumstance, when you had this group of survivors that were on the run and they were in this very precarious situation, it was easy, in fact, to imagine that they were going to resort to torture, because we just believed that was the reality of what would happen, and we felt an obligation to tell that part of the story. But the question was, well, what's the show about? The message is torture is bad? Well, no kidding. And we didn't want to say, well, torture is good, and so we were sort of caught in sort of trying to figure out, well, why were we doing the show, and what's the show about? And we settled on, well, it's really not about that question. It's about really making the audience ask the questions to themselves and let them watch the show. Let them watch Cara Thrace, who's our hero, who's somebody that they care about, who they like. Watch her do these things to another person. And the person would be a machine. It would not be a human being by definition. It's a machine, but it's a machine that cries, sweats, bleeds, cries out in pain. And what does that do to, when you sit across the table from something that is acting like a human being and is crying like a human being and seems to be in pain like a human being, at what point do you start to, does the wall between you break down? And having the audience set up so that we tee up the classic ticking bomb scenario. Oh, he says there's a warhead. There's a ticking clock. Okay. We decided to tee up the classic ticking bomb scenario. He says there's a nuclear warhead somewhere in the fleet. She's got to get the information out of him, and she's going to torture him to get the information. But at the end, there was no bomb. And it was a series of moral choices through it. How far was she willing to go? How far was the audience going to go with her on this ride? At what point would their sympathy flip? At what point would they start to say, I know he's a Cylon, I know they just committed genocide against the entire human race, but I really don't want to watch him put his head in that bucket again. I don't want to watch them beat him to death again. At what point do they start feeling like, okay, enough, don't show this to me again? And then the key thing to me was at the end of the show where the president, Laura Roslin, comes in and she says to him, tell me where the warhead is and I promise you'll be okay. I give you my word as the president, it'll be okay. And he tells her there's no bomb. And she says, okay, and she throws him out the airlock. And there was something about that moment that I thought encapsulated the show. It was, how do you feel about that? You know, how do you feel about the breakdown of the moral authority? How do you feel about the lie of that? How do you feel about killing the guy even though you promised not to him, even though he's a bad guy? You know, what does it say about how we feel about ourselves? What does it say about our honor? What does it say about integrity? What does it say about all the things that we tell ourselves that matter, actually? And to me, Galactica, at its best, is putting the audience in these uncomfortable positions where, because it's a science fiction piece and it's not a contemporary drama that has to sort of deal with real-life terrorism, real-life Islamic issues and security issues and that, I can move the chess pieces around and make you look at it from a different point of view. And I can do the show where we did an episode in season 3 where the characters were under an occupation and the human characters had resorted to suicide bombings to fight against the occupying Cylons. And there was a great scene where the former president, Laura Roslin, was being held in detention by the occupying Cylons. Gaius Baltar, who was essentially set up as the traitor who was working with the Cylons and betrayed the human beings, and he goes in to talk to Laura. And it's the classic scenario where, well, she's obviously the heroine, we like her, we hate him because he's the villain and he's betrayed them all. So you kind of, the scene is set very neatly for you. But in the body of the scene is about the fact that he's come to her to say, I need you to come with me and denounce suicide bombing as a tactic. And suddenly the scene shifts and the audience is very uncomfortable with this because they suddenly really don't know whose side that they're on and what they're supposed to feel and who they're rooting for and who they're hissing against. And she was uncomfortable and couldn't quite give him a straight answer. And he was pressing her, do you believe about sending people with explosives strapped to their chest, walking them into crowded places and detonating that? How can you defend that? And she couldn't defend that, but she couldn't agree with him either. And I guess, to me, the Galactica at its best was essentially saying, we, the storytellers, don't know what the answers to these things are. Some of these issues are so complicated and so difficult to wrestle with that we, as writers, can't give you an answer in 44 minutes and change this week. You know, I can't tell you what the answer to Iraq is in 44 minutes. I can't tell you what the answer to terrorism is in 44 minutes. I can't tell you about, the obligations of the state versus its prisoner and how, where the lines are about, saving people versus violating your moral code in 44 minutes. Some of these questions we have come to expect that our storytellers will give us a nice little moral to the story by the end and solve all these questions. And I guess I don't fundamentally believe that that answer always exists. And so I sort of thought of Galactica as a place to allow you to look at these questions through a different prism because it's science fiction, because they're not called Republicans, because they're not called Islamists, because it's not called Iraq. And I shift the pieces around and I can let you just think about the underlying issues involved and let you really think about what matters to you? What do you think she should have done? What do you think he should have done? Are you still cheering for the same person? Are you still booing for the same person? Or do you walk away just confused? And to me, that's the intent of the show, and that's what we've tried to do for the last 4 years.
Thank you. There are mics on each side. I would ask you to line up at the microphone. Please, once again, be succinct, to the point, and please, if you're directing your question to someone particularly on the panel or more broadly, please state that at the outset, okay? And I'll go to the person here to the right who's standing here first.
Hi. This question, I have two questions. The first one is for Kamran, related to your show Kings. As a Jewish person, I was a little bit disturbed by the statement that King David was a terrorist, and I'm holding his Book of Psalms. Do you have anybody who's of knowledgeable Jewish background consulting on that show?
I mean, this is Hollywood, and so there's quite a few Jews.
What? that doesn't necessarily mean they know things.
My executive producer is Michael Green, and I'm not speaking for him. I don't want it that's what it is. I don't know he would characterize it that way. I'm characterizing that way as one person. Michael Green, who is Jewish, and also his mother's from Israel, and he has got very deep training in biblical scholarship. But if you now I'm speaking for myself, I'm not speaking for anyone else. I'm certainly not speaking for the show. I'm not talking about Kings, I'm talking about the Bible. If you look at the Book of Chronicles, King David did flee to the Philistines. He fought for them. He killed women and children intentionally. It's there in the Book of Chronicles. People don't like to look back at it. And later, Talmud and other scholarship in the Midrash, Jewish rabbinic tradition, became very uncomfortable with the way that story was spread out. And they said, okay, I think that what really happened here, for example, the traditional story of David having an affair with Bathsheba, later rabbinic scholarship said, no, actually they didn't really have an affair because God had already married her in heaven. And so they weren't actually committing adultery because he is a promised son of God. That's not the actual traditional chronicle story. Later scholarship goes back and tries to understand it in a traditional Jewish moral way. But
I'm just really nervous about you as a Muslim telling the story of what is part of the Jewish people. So that's my first question. The second question,
number one, that's a personal thing, and I'm one writer on a show, and I'm happy to talk about it personally. And if you're uncomfortable, it's unfortunate. I've been a Muslim growing up, we're very uncomfortable in Hollywood, so we can talk about that.
One question, please. Okay, I really will prevail on you for that because we have to end at 8:30, and so if you have other questions, please come to the reception afterwards. Over here on this side.
This question is for Ron. In the third season of Galactica finale, you've got the comment by Lee Adama testifying at Gaius Baltar's trial, basically comparing actions of the military when they breach rules and standards to a gang. And I just wanted you to talk about that a little bit more, because it seems to be a commentary that some of the conduct, when we do torture people, that we're acting more like thugs instead of professional military personnel.
That's a fair analogy. I mean, it was the middle of the trial of Gaius Baltar, and Lee was called, ironically, in his defense, and essentially he gave this long, eloquent defense about, I thought it was an eloquent defense, about the reasons why ultimately he wasn't any more guilty than many of them were around him. And I remember wanting to essentially say, look, these people, there's only 50 or 40,000 of them left, and they've managed to hold on to these uniforms, and they're holding on to these rules very tightly because they're trying to hang on to any piece of their civilization that's left. But they did feel free to go outside those rules, and they did feel free to break the rules when it suited their purposes, and they went way beyond what they ever would have done back home. And at a certain point, they were sort of acting more like a gang of thugs, and might made right, and they were able to sort of press through their ideas simply because the guys with the guns were making the rules. And I wanted them to at least have to grapple with that idea and sort of understand, even if they weren't going to change it and it had to be that way because that was the situation, I wanted them to at least have to face it and face sort of who they were and what they had really become.
Thank you. Over here.
This is for Howard Gordon. I like your show. I enjoyed watching
Remember
show.
what I said. I love that you love the show, but question, please.
Okay, exciting. Now, my question to you is, you're a very likable guy, but how, after seeing you in person, I said, how could such a nice-looking, likable guy make such a horrible show?
You can ask my wife or my therapist.
Okay. Okay, but it's true. My question is, in your show, the Arab terrorists come, they say, in the name of Allah. And then, you give a kind of impression that all the Muslims are terrorists, And you give such an impression. That goes to boil down, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, and thou shalt not call the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So in your show, I think you're breaking these two commandments quite often. Can you make a show that somehow give the impression to the audience, those people who are doing evil are not really believing in their God?
Well,
my question.
Again, the show doesn't have the opportunity because of its nature, which is as Dahlia described it. It does take place because it is a thriller in real time. And it does employ as its narrative frame the ticking time bomb scenario. It did before 9/11, and anyway. First of all, to your statement about our sole and unique portrayal of Muslims as terrorists, it's not true. It's very far from the truth, and I really want to clarify that there are characters on the show. And last year, CTU, the counter-terrorist unit, was run by a female Muslim. There have been innocent Muslims. If you saw the rest of that, the rest of that clip as that continues on, we're in a post-terror. There's a guy who runs the Muslim advocacy group who is interred wrongly, and he actually is dating the president's wife. So there's some very reputable Muslim characters in our show. Muslim Americans. There have been multiple incidents where Muslims are beaten up because of xenophobic redneck yahoos because of their fear. So it's not uniquely the case. We have probably painted again with the same brush. Caspian Sea oil oligarchs, white guys wanting So it's a thriller. There are lots of bad. We've had Chechen separatists, and we've had the Chinese, and we've had. I think there's not a place on the map that we haven't made the bad guys. I think Sweden is the only place that we've left. So anyway, that's my first one. And as far as I guess it does bother me as a person who I think is a person of conscience and of consequence. I hope or appreciating my consequence. It's something that I grapple with, and we all grapple with as writers. We don't take it lightly, and as Ron said, it's been an education for all of us.
Thank you.
Okay, and I have been instructed by the organizer of this event that we need to have students asking questions. So I'm going to ask if anybody is a student over here on this side, more than anyone else, step up to the mic first. So if you're the USC student in the sweatshirt there, you step up and ask the question first.
Great. Okay, my question is primarily for Mr. Moore, but for the other writers and producers as well. In light of Ms. Hashad's speech with addressing the influence that TV has on the up-and-coming leaders and in the military and politics, what do you feel is the writer's responsibility to their audience?
Well, that's a good question, and I've wrestled with that over the years. I think I've always sort of felt that in a very sort of self-centered universe that the writer's responsibility is to the material and to himself or herself, and that our responsibility is to tell the best story that we can and to make the greatest use of our talents, and that sometimes that story might be something very dark and twisted, and that might be a very ugly story, but that's the story that I choose to tell you. And I've always sort of felt that there's a bright line there, that I am presenting this, and what you do with it is then your business and your responsibility. I think as I've gotten older and as I've done this job more and more, I think it's probably not as simple as that. And I think there is a complex, like I was saying earlier, there's a complicated relationship between the storyteller and his or her audience. And I don't know that I have the answer to that anymore. I know that it's important to me to tell certain types of stories from my own moral perspective and my own sort of political perspective, my own sort of perspective on life. And I try to be honest to what I think, and try not to tell a cynical story just to get you to have a certain reaction. I try not to be in judgment of other people in Hollywood, but I would never write Saw. That's not something I could do. I find that an incredibly cynical, ugly piece of material to do. Now, I don't think that that's why they did it, and I don't think that the people who made it are evil and bad and should be banned and we shouldn't have the film or anything. But I guess by my lights, I couldn't make that piece of material, and so I think my responsibility is to make material I feel good about, that I think is moral by my standards of what I want to show to you. And I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but it's the only one I've sort of come to at this point.
I actually wanted to add on to that. Ron's absolutely right when he's been saying that we writers, we sit in a room and we try to make the story work. And we're often not thinking in terms of any kind of, quote, social responsibility of a storyline. It's a story. On my show, Sleeper Cell, we had to, because the show was intentionally created in response to September 11th, and we're looking at how does Al-Qaeda think, what do they think, and we were very aware that people are watching our show, and they want to get an insight as to what the enemy is thinking like, and hopefully get a little bit of insight into what mainstream Islam is. And so and the great thing about the show was it was very politically divided. One of our showrunners was very liberal, one of our showrunners was very conservative, and we all fought it out in the room, and and it all got into the series. The huge arguments that we would have politically and religiously were all played out by the characters. The characters would play out the arguments we were having in the room. And so we were very aware in the episodes we did dealing with torture, dealing with this, that everyone has a different point of view, and we went intentionally out of our way to present all points of view for similar things what Ron did in Galactica very effectively, so that you walk away going, all right, I've made my own conclusion, and we're not going to tell you what that conclusion is. And in the room, we couldn't come to a conclusion because we all fought each other. So.
Yeah. Question?
This question is for Dahlia. You spoke a lot about the influence that TV has on real situations and real people in the real world. And you also spoke about the ticking time bomb scenario and device, which is a device that TV writers use to make things more exciting and more entertaining, the same way that Shakespeare used comedy to make his plays more entertaining. So my question for you is, the influence that TV has over people, is the problem the TV writers, or is the problem the education system? And are you scapegoating writers for doing something that writers have done for hundreds of years? And do you have any suggestions of how they can better communicate with their audience while not negatively influencing them?
Let me start. I hope I didn't offend anyone. anyone sitting on the stage.
I can take it.
And the question today was, does TV influence post 9/11 policy? Does what we see on TV matter for what really happens in the world? And without question, yes, is the answer. And that's what my speech was about. My speech wasn't to knock anyone upside the head, because they didn't go into their profession to do what I do. They're not writing TV to change the world. They're writing TV to entertain the world. And they're succeeding. And the reason, and this is kind of, unfortunately, a very sad side effect of, or a very sad consequence to 24's success, that it is so successful, it is so entertaining, it is so gripping that people are consumed with it and feel that this actually happens and that they should be behaving in this way. And that's what I was talking about.
My question is, do you think then there's a problem with the education system if that's how they're basing their opinions on something?
Well, I think there's a huge problem with the way, there are policies as well, right? That soldiers aren't doing this. Soldiers aren't just watching 24 and doing this in a vacuum. Soldiers are watching 24 and they're being told by their commander that waterboarding, which for those of you who don't know, it's strapping an individual to a board on their back, tipping them backwards, and pouring a continuous stream of water on their face until they literally drown, until the water fills their lungs. You turn them up, you revive them, and then you do it again, over and over. The administration changed that from it is no longer torture, which we have said for years. We have prosecuted people for doing this. It is no longer torture. It is now, quote, a professional interrogation technique. That's a quote. This is our law, and this is legal under this is what our military is allowed to do. And so it is not. It's a complicated matter. It's not a matter of blaming TV. It's not a matter of blaming the fact that, you know, in school people aren't learning what torture is, and we don't know about international law. It's a very complicated mess that we have to sort through, and I think the first step in sorting through is recognizing where some of these influences are happening and trying to figure out together how to change this for the better, because no one here is happy about people being tortured.
Okay, question from the side.
Hi, this question's for Howard Gordon. I just wanted to follow up on your claim of 24's neutrality on the issue of torture by asking about two different things that came up in the news. The first one was a couple of years ago, the Heritage Foundation hosted a forum on the war on terror in which Michael Chertoff spoke, Joel Surnow attended.
I was there too.
You were there as well. Yeah. And I know that there was private White House meeting with Joel Surnow and members of the White House.
I was there too, so I could speak firsthand to the whole story.
So clearly they're fans of the show.
Right.
And then the follow-up to that is I was curious about your response to Jane Mayer's new book that just came out that shows that the White House lawyers who actually crafted the interrogation policy were using Jack Bauer as an example in their arguments, in fact, more than they were using the Constitution or international law. And, I mean, do you feel like your show really is neutral on the issue of torture if people are using it in that way?
Can you let him go ahead and answer?
Yes.
As to the neutrality of on torture, I don't advocate torture. No one on the show advocates torture. It's neither propaganda. It's not it's a narrative device that again predated our, I think, awareness of torture. As to the White House event, that was I met, well, we were invited, I was invited, it was actually my fault. I met this woman who worked for the Heritage Foundation, and she asked if I would come out. I said, well, actually, I feel uncomfortable doing that. Can you get another think tank on the other side of the aisle to co-sponsor it? And I will absolutely be glad to get a bunch of actors and writers to come out, but I'm uncomfortable. Really, the day before this, or 2 days before this was to happen, it was the Center for Strategic Studies, which is a left-leaning think tank, pulled out when it turned out that Heritage, which was the primary sponsor, had Rush Limbaugh as the moderator. But there was a member on the panel, so the point is, it was designed, and again, because I was one of the architects of that whole meeting, it turned into what it was, and I had a choice at the last minute to do it. I chose to go.
But do you think in your show torture is shown to be effective?
Because, well, no, the answer is...
Because you're saying it's neutral and there's
I never said it was neutral. Yes, the bottom line and the conundrum here is that torture is an effective narrative technique. Jack Bauer gets the guy who is always the bad guy, or seldom not the bad guy, and it works, unlike reality. Is that a problem for our country? Is it a problem for our policymakers? Is it a problem for our soldiers? Well, apparently it is. And it's a conundrum that we find ourselves in as writers who are, again, beholden to a story that predated the issues that we're describing and predated the policy that you're describing that has been co-opted by John Yoo and by the policymakers and by Justice Scalia and by these other people. But I find myself in an impossible situation. You have to, I guess, appreciate what's been set up here, that as a writer, my job is to sort of take this character, tell a story that has now had much, much broader social and political implications than the story, and the DNA and the intent of the story started out being. And without renouncing that character, which this year I think we've dealt with more nuance and I think more complexity. And hopefully, I like to think that we have asked those questions rather than answering them. But yes, Jack Bauer takes a guy, it's the right guy, and he gets the answers. I mean, that's what it is. Is that advocating torture as a policy? Well, it's advocating torture as a narrative technique on 24. Mm-hmm. And if you choose to say it's propaganda, it's what the show is, or what part of the show is, I should say.
And like I was saying earlier, these are complicated. It's a complicated interrelationship. The function of 24 is not to be a policy paper. It is not a white paper that is issued as far as an argument of what American policy should be. It's a form of entertainment, but it has influence, and it's not the only show that has weird and unexpected influences in the real world. One of my best friends that I went to college with works on CSI, and CSI is having an impact in the American judicial system that prosecutors are talking about all across the country, where juries are sitting in jury boxes and fully expect to have the thin hair of DNA And it's true. Their juries are sitting in court and going, well, where's all the stuff? I mean, where's the this, where's the that, where's the black light and the thing and the 5 flips and are actually having problems getting convictions in certain cases because they didn't have all the forensic evidence that juries, and they know this from the after interviews and questionnaires that they conduct with jurors about what happened, and they have an expectation based on that one television show that this is how crime scene investigation really works, and you should have all these little things, and if you don't have them, they feel like they shouldn't convict people. And that is a strange reverberation of a completely fictional universe that is not intended by any of those people that work on that show, who have no responsibility for the American judicial system, but are definitely having an impact. And it's really just, like I was saying earlier, it's about this relationship between we watch fantasy and then we choose to believe it's true, and we choose to believe that it has power, and we choose to then alter our lives in the direction of these fantasies. And I don't know that it's as simple.
Well, I also want to add that, and this is something I think really, really worth looking at, is that 24, and this goes to the question about Jane Mayer's book, which just came out. What's it called again? I don't remember the name. She's a, but it's about. Does anyone know? The Dark Side. So it's really it's a book about our policy, and particularly our policy with regard to torture and interrogation. And I have to say that 24 has, if you look at it, has been, I think, in some ways, the best thing for this issue. We have been the honey to the well. I mean, you say poo, but meanwhile we're cited by Amnesty International. We are, in other words, we have brought this issue. We're all talking about it here tonight because of the show. So to say, and now we can debate that, what this is about in terms of policy. We've actually brought it out, and if it happens at our expense or at the show's expense or at the expense of being accused of being a mouthpiece for the Bush administration, well, so be it. But we're talking about it, and that's a good thing. By my lights.
We're also talking about it, to be real. We're talking about it because we're torturing. Our country is out there torturing individuals who haven't been convicted of anything, who haven't ever seen a court, who haven't,
But I'm saying, but Jane Mayer, and again, this pretext or this story that 24 is this causal thing, rather than, as Ron said, this interesting mirror in a mirror dance with reality, is, I think, a simplistic, and reductive, assessment of what it is. And I think ultimately, if we're talking about it, that is nothing but a great thing. That's I feel.
That's a great place to end because, first of all, I'm really happy they proved my point, which is that the narratives, the stories we see in entertainment media, I think often have greater resonance than what we read in the news for us. And they're able to touch us and affect us in ways that we don't allow oftentimes the news to, because it does seem too real. And as an avid television watcher, I'm really grateful to all three of you for keeping me away from my scholarly duties. I'd like to remind you that if you enjoyed this panel, please come again on October 22nd, or join us tomorrow at 5, anytime on Friday in Doheny, where we will continue discussing how TV narratives shape ethical dilemmas and spiritual issues. We're going to break now. Most of our panel